Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer. This is an episode in a series entitled Thriving Through an Audit. And in just a minute, you're going to understand why this series has that title when you understand who I'm sharing this table with. This is a series tailored to brokers, not just designated brokers. And so you might listen to that title, Thriving Through an Audit, and think to yourself, well, I don't get audited. My firm gets audited. Brokers, when your firm gets audited, it's your files that are reviewed and your actions are scrutinized. And if there are problems that develop for a firm based on the firm's audit, guess who gets investigated? The broker's license to the firm. You want your firm to thrive through an audit, and you want to avoid investigations. And so this video series will help you understand the actions you should take in order to enable your firm to thrive through an audit. So let me tell you who I've got sitting at this table with me, because there could not be better folks to assist us in providing this education. Bill Dutra and Cathy McDonald. Who are you two?
And my name is Bill Dutra. I work with the Department of Licensing, our Business and Professions Division. So one of the many professions that I work with on a daily basis is the real estate professions, specifically real estate brokers, managing brokers. I've been with the division for about just over 30 years, and the majority of that time spent with the real estate programs.
Thank you.
And I'm Cathy McDonald. I am the audit supervisor for the real estate program. I have worked in the audit unit for over 16 years. I have a staff of 9 auditors that enjoy engaging with the real estate industry and helping the designated brokers and their firms come into compliance. And that's what we do.
Thank you both for being here. Honestly, we as an industry are so benefited by you all taking time to help educate brokers about what the department's expectations are of them. So truly, thank you for being here and sharing your wisdom with our members. Okay, the first topic we want to address is timely submission of documents. Now, Cathy, I'm going to pick on you. When I say that, I know that means something to you, timely submission of documents. When I say that, what do you want brokers to know that I'm talking about?
So what that means to me from an audit perspective is that you as a broker or managing broker will submit your documents to your firm or designated broker within 2 business days of mutual acceptance. That could be mutual acceptance of a purchase and sale agreement. It could be mutual acceptance of a listing agreement. It could be any type of service that you provide. Once you get those signatures on it, then it needs to be submitted to your firm or designated broker within 2 business days.
Okay, so I have mutual acceptance on July 1st, and then sometime thereafter, I help my client negotiate the inspection contingency response form. So it's later than July 1st. When is that document due?
2 days from the signatures on it, once it's signed all the way around.
Okay, so mutual acceptance would be the transaction, the purchase and sale agreement itself. Within 2 days, that document has to be submitted. And then any later added addenda, they have to be provided to the firm within 2 days following mutual acceptance of that document.
Mm-hmm. So all documents as signatures happen throughout the transaction.
So what documents are required to be submitted?
So the expectation of our department is that all documents, contracts, agreements, anything that has to do with a transaction must be submitted to the broker. To the firm. The documents that have that 2-day requirement are more of like the legal documents. So the actual agreements and contracts, those have to come in within 2 days. There's lots of things that have to be maintained in your file. Those need to be brought in to the designated broker or firm upon whatever the policy is of your firm. It could be prior to closing, like for material correspondence, electronic communications. You've got preliminary commitments for title insurance and sales files. You've got all sorts of things. You might have a CMA in there. There could be all sorts of things that go into that file that make that file. But the only things that we track for the 2-day turn-in are contractual.
So anytime there is mutual acceptance of a document, has to be submitted within 2 days of mutual acceptance. So all of the other documents that you just named that are retained within the transaction folder, settlement statement, correspondence, receipts.
Mhm.
If a broker has handled earnest money, for example, any documents that don't have a date of mutual acceptance, how would a broker know when those documents must be submitted to the firm's transaction folder?
That would be up to the designated broker to dictate those timelines as far as when. So that would be from policies or procedures of your firm.
Okay. And when I'm teaching it the way I often explain it, and tell me if you have any qualms with this, I say within 2 business days of mutual acceptance of any document that has mutual acceptance. And if it's a document that doesn't have mutual acceptance, then whenever your designated broker says, so there should be an office policy on this issue, but in any event, not later than closing.
For sure. A little bit different and I know we're not going to talk about this right now, but probably a little bit different answer when we start talking about earnest money receipts.
Some designated brokers have an office policy that says, if a broker has not provided all of the transaction documentation required for a transaction folder, then the broker's not getting their commission check. Are you familiar with that ever happening?
Yes.
Yeah, we don't regulate that. We don't regulate anything to do with commissions. As far that's between that designated broker and that firm and that licensee, what is in their independent contractor agreement or whatever type of an agreement they have. So that's not something that we look for. It's not something that we regulate. It's something we really don't offer an opinion on.
Okay. Earnest money receipts are part of the documents that have to be submitted in the transaction folder. We're going to flesh that out a little bit more in a subsequent video. Let's talk about some of the other documents that have to be retained within the transaction folder. You mentioned correspondence. What is correspondence?
Well, it's defined as material correspondence in the law. It doesn't give a definition. We basically tell the designated brokers that it's up to them to determine what is material correspondence. On the other side of that, most of it's become electronic. Electronic communications are required with no definition. It doesn't say material correspondence, that's electronic. It's 2 separate requirements. So most of the correspondence that we see in files now is electronic. It's either threads of messages, instant messages, or threads of emails. I always tell the designated brokers it's a lot easier just to keep the whole thread than it is to try and edit the thread from the standpoint of just record keeping. It's much simpler. Some licensees choose to go in and have their designated broker or the broker determine what is material, but we leave that up to the designated broker to determine what is material correspondence. But when it comes to electronic communication, it's everything that's regarding the transaction.
And I think it's really important to remember is that we've come across a lot of situations, a lot of complaints. As you can imagine, people complain to us about a lot of things. We only get one side of the story when somebody complains. When we go out and we talk to firms, we talk to brokers, individual brokers, it's amazing we get the other side of the story. And usually the other side of that story is in that material correspondence. It's, here's the text message, or here's the email I had with this client that talked about this thing that they're upset about. That really helps us out to say, we don't have an issue here. So again, it's more is better. And it's to your, not only is it a statutory requirement, but it helps when there is a problem with our agency. We turn to that, we look for that. And a lot of firms are starting to understand that. But I think this is a great reminder is, even if you think it's material to it, just keep it. It's not harming anything.
Yeah. Or if you're not sure whether it's material, err on the side of keeping it. When I teach this, I typically say, if it has anything, no matter how remote, to do with the transaction, put it in there.
Yes.
And I also teach brokers to follow up conversations that they might have had, oral conversations that they might have had with somebody. And it doesn't just have to be the client. Not the broker on the other side of the transaction, maybe not even the party on the other side of the transaction. They might have had a conversation with a contractor. Maybe they were coordinating with that contractor to get out to the property to do the work in time to have it done prior to closing. The broker, you need to commit to the transaction folder. The fact that you had that conversation, that might be material. If that contractor fails to show up, but the client had trusted you to communicate with that contractor to set the schedule, may not be your fault that they didn't show up. But if you can't prove that you had set that schedule with them, then you might not have done what the client had the expectation based on your communications with the client that you were going to be doing. So as remote as that is, it would still be material correspondence. That's an oral communication. How does a broker document an oral communication in their transaction folder?
I think just what you said, they can take notes of that conversation. They can follow back up with that individual. I understood you didn't say XYZ. You can at least send that email or that text message to them. They may not respond to you, but you can show that you have taken that effort to follow up that oral conversation. If nothing else, take notes of when you talk to somebody, when you left them a message. You talk about the contractor. It may also be dealing with an appraiser, possibly, letting them access to a home inspector, the lender. Depending what type of loan it is, it could be somebody else that is coming into that. Document.
And then further to the whether or not it's material, I often say when you do follow up in writing, oftentimes probably the person who receives that email isn't going to respond because they just see you as, CYAing your file, essentially. And so sometimes it behooves you to ask a question that will get a response. And so if you can ask a transactional question, when will you be available to hear about the contractor's findings? When will you be available to review this information or that information? Or if there's no question that makes sense along those lines, ask about their child's rehearsal. How did it go? How did the dog's vet appointment turn out? People love to answer questions like that about themselves. I don't care what their answer is to any of those questions, but if they reply with an answer, now you've got proof that they received your communication, and you're able to easily document your transaction folder with proof of that material correspondence.
Certainly, all good advice.
Okay, one more thing, advertising. Now, we've had this conversation before. I'm going to just tell you right out that Washington law does not require retention of advertising in a firm's transaction folder. Is that a true statement?
That is correct.
I think that's terrible practice. Let me back up. If your practice is not to retain copies of your advertising in your firm's transaction folder, that would be a big mistake, in my opinion. And so when I teach this issue, I sometimes confess that it's not a requirement. Sometimes I just say it's a requirement. It should be a firm's requirement that brokers provide to the firm copies of all advertising that they use to market the property or themselves. How come? Because if there is a challenge later by a consumer about what a broker said with respect to the advertising of this property, what is the best proof you can have of what you actually said versus what the consumer is saying you said? The actual ad copy, right? So keep a copy of all of your advertising. If your advertising is a billboard advertising you as a broker, take a picture of it and put the picture in a firm transaction folder that can be retained somehow for future reference. Whatever the advertising might be. You might have a radio ad. Keep a copy of the transcript. Whatever it might be. I know you guys can't speak to that one, but I have to get on that soapbox. Okay. Is there anything important to brokers to know about submission of documents for their firm to maintain in the firm's transaction folder that we haven't talked about yet? You can think of? Holding aside earnest money?
I think we didn't talk about, I guess, what needs to be submitted under what circumstances.
You're right. Thank you. That's a huge category. Thank you.
So our expectation is that records are submitted for all contracts in 2 days from mutual acceptance. However, there is an expectation of record retention even if full signatures are not maintained. So an example I will give is, so you go out on a listing appointment and the first day the spouse signs it and you're supposed to go back the next day to get the other spouse's signature. You get there and they've changed their mind. We don't want to list our house. We're going to wait a couple months for whatever the case may be, right? Okay, well, you've got one third party signature on that contract. Now, the 2-day document turn-in kind of is out the window at this point, but it doesn't mean it does not have to be submitted to your firm. You're required to turn it in because it has that one signature on it of a third party, and your firm is expected to keep it. So it doesn't necessarily meet the requirements for 2-day document turn-in, but it does meet the requirements of needing to be submitted to your firm.
Perfect. And so let's develop this a little further. because I agree with you. It's really easy to understand that a transaction folder would be required for a closed transaction. That's simple. Cathy just gave an example of a listing agreement signed by one seller, but not the second seller. So it's never becomes a listing agreement because it was never fully agreed, but you still have to submit it to your firm for retention. You might have a buyer brokerage agreement. A buyer brokerage agreement would certainly require delivery to the firm, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
Even if that buyer never buys?
Yep.
Yes.
What about an offer that a buyer makes that is never accepted?
Same thing.
Same thing.
And this goes back to your rule that if a third party has signed it, it has to be submitted to I think that's the easiest way to remember this.
Mm-hmm.
If a third party, meaning not you, not somebody licensed to your firm, if anybody who's a third party to your firm signs the document, then the broker has to submit the document for retention to the firm. Is that right?
Yep.
And so the one thing I want to just add is that we're using a lot of, expectations and policies and whatnot. These are coming directly from the statutes and rules that we're referencing. So these are statutory requirements that brokers have to give these documents to the firm, and the firm has a statutory requirement to maintain these. So again, help your brokers, designated brokers, thrive through an audit. These are the questions that we ask, and what we've said before in other videos is when we receive a complaint, we work backwards. We start at the beginning and work our way up. And it's easy for us to do that. We can see where the mistakes are. Try to get out in front of those mistakes.
Yeah. So as the broker submitting your documents, you don't know what transaction might end up in an investigation or even litigation. And there's a 6-year statute of limitations on a written contract. If you get sued 5.5 years from now on a transaction that's closing today, what's the likelihood in 5.5 years that you're going to be able to recreate the transaction documents? Slim to none, particularly correspondence and all of that. Mm-hmm. So that's Bill's message. Make sure that you are engaged in good practices right now, protecting you and your firm from whatever might come in the future with respect to client complaints, investigations, audit findings, litigation, another broker who's mad at you filing a complaint, all of that. Have good practices now so that you can enable yourself to thrive through whatever that later event might be. If you have questions on this topic or any other, please send a question to me by visiting the legal hotline at warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.